The sound of boots on gravel echoed across the yard as a group of captured German officers were marched past a row of weathered wooden barns in the late summer of 1944. They had been transported from the ports of New York to the heartland, places like Iowa and Nebraska, where the U.S. Army built camps not far from ordinary farms, to men who had marched through the ruins of Europe. These barns seemed laughably rustic. A tall officer, Hauptmann Friedrich Adler, let out a loud, scornful laugh that rippled through the group. "This is what America calls civilization, a barn fit only for cattle," he sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. Others joined him, mocking the rough timber walls, the creaking roof lines, the faint smell of hay drifting out into the warm air. It was not only arrogance, but also a form of defense. These men, stripped of weapons and status, clung fiercely to a sense of superiority in their minds. Barns were symbols of a backward society, crude boxes, nothing like the stone stables of Bavaria or the carefully tended granaries of Saxony. Their ridicule was not merely about the wood and nails, it was about pride. If they could laugh, they could still feel above the captors who had taken them across an ocean in humiliation. But for the American guards, the laughter passed unnoticed. These young soldiers, many only 19 or 20, barely raised an eyebrow. To them, barns were as ordinary as the smell of coffee in the morning or the whistle of a train at dusk. They had grown up with them, worked inside them, hauled corn and milk from them. The prisoners' derision sounded like the mocking of men who simply did not understand. One corporal leaned on his rifle and watched. He knew what lay beyond those barn doors. He had helped unload the deliveries the day before, barrels of dried beans, stacks of flour sacks, crates of canned peaches, stamped with the year's date. He thought of the German men laughing and wondered how their faces would change when they finally saw inside. That moment of anticipation hung in the air. The Germans jeered louder, their voices bouncing off the walls, as if to convince themselves that their ridicule was truth. They joked about the smell of manure, about Americans living like peasants. Yet behind their mocking eyes was exhaustion, days on trains, weeks without certainty, stomachs tightened from rations that never filled them. Their pride masked hunger, fear, and the unspoken knowledge that their homeland was burning under Allied bombs. In that moment, the barns became more than wood and hay. They became a stage, waiting for the curtain to rise on a revelation that would shatter their illusions. What they thought was weakness would soon reveal itself as overwhelming strength. If you value stories like this, don't forget to like and subscribe. It helps preserve forgotten chapters of history. And tell me, where are you watching from? And what time is it right now as you hear this story? The laughter still echoed in their throats as the German prisoners shuffled further into the camp, but their minds began drifting back across the Atlantic. Memories of home stirred, and with them came a quiet current of pride. For all their scorn of American barns, they carried in their hearts the images of European farms, orderly, compact, and rooted in centuries of tradition. In Bavaria, a farmer's land was small but elegant. Stone granaries stood solid against the wind, their slate roofs gleaming when it rained. Timber barns were built with precision, beams carved and polished until they seemed part of the earth itself. A lieutenant named Otto Kruger whispered to his comrade about his family's farm near Augsburg. He described the hayloft stacked tight, the stables neat and dry, the chicken coop aligned in perfect symmetry. "Our barns," he muttered, "were refined, crafted with pride, not these rough American boxes." His tone carried not just nostalgia, but a fierce defense of identity. Another man, Unteroffizier Wilhelm Meyer, remembered his childhood mornings in Lower Saxony. He told of the sound of cows lowing at dawn, the smell of bread baking in a farmhouse kitchen, the tidy rows of barley that stretched like a patchwork quilt across the fields. He spoke with conviction, as if reciting proof that German agriculture was superior. In his pocket was a folded scrap of paper, a letter from his sister written in the winter of 1943, describing how their village survived on black bread and thin cabbage soup. Yet when he compared those words with the barns before him, he pushed the thought aside. Pride was his shield, and memory his armor. This inner boasting was not just about farms. It was about a vision of Europe that many of them had been raised to believe that theirs was a culture of sophistication, precision, and order. While America was sprawling, chaotic, and crude, they remembered their propaganda lessons, the speeches that painted Americans as shallow materialists, people without tradition, even here, as captives in a foreign land. That belief gave them a brittle sense of dignity, but behind the proud recollections lay something more fragile: hunger. They could not help but think of what was happening back home in 1944. Allied bombers had already struck Hamburg, Cologne, and Berlin. Fields had been burned, livestock slaughtered or stolen, transport lines severed. Statistics told the harsh truth: by late 1944, German food production had fallen by nearly 30% compared to pre-war levels. While Allied bombing campaigns destroyed over 500,000 tons of grain in storage, families relied on rations that rarely exceeded 100 to 200 calories per day. The irony was sharp. These men remembered neat granaries, but their own people were eating nettle soup and grinding acorns into flour. They sneered at American barns as crude, yet they themselves had marched hungry through villages where children fainted in bread lines. Pride covered this wound, but only barely. As they approached the looming barn doors, one prisoner whispered almost defiantly, "It cannot be better than home." His words hung in the air like a last defense, fragile and hollow. As the wooden beams towered above them, the moment came with a creak of iron hinges and the long groan of timber pushed outward. A pair of American guards heaved open the massive barn doors, and suddenly the bright sunlight flooded inside. Dust motes swirled in the golden air, and the laughter of the German prisoners broke off mid-breath. Silence fell so heavy it seemed to press against their chests. Inside, the cavernous space stretched like a cathedral. The first thing they saw were mountains of golden corn, stacked high in burlap sacks that reached nearly to the rafters. Wheat-filled wooden bins that groaned under the sheer weight. Potatoes, larger than any they had seen in years, spilled from crates, their skins shining like polished leather, and hanging from the thick beams overhead were rows upon rows of smoked hams and sides of bacon, their scent faint but undeniable, drifting into the dry summer air. One young prisoner, barely 20, stumbled a step forward. His name was Heinrich Bauer, a farmhand from near Dresden. His lips moved before he could stop himself. This is only one farm storage." His voice cracked with disbelief and then died into the hush of the moment. No one laughed anymore. The barn, which moments earlier had been mocked as a crude shack, now stood before them as a fortress of plenty. The contrast struck at the deepest part of their pride. For years, German propaganda had told them America was soft, decadent, incapable of sacrifice. Yet here was abundance beyond imagination, housed not in a military depot, not in a government warehouse, but in a simple farmer's barn. Hauptmann Adler, the officer who had led the earlier mocking, clenched his jaw. His eyes scanned the rows of grain sacks and smoked meat, and something in his face tightened. Only days earlier, he had written in his diary that his family in Leipzig survived on turnip stew, with bread rations cut to 200 grams per day. Now, before his eyes, one barn held enough to feed thousands. Statistics sharpened the sting. By 1944, American farms produced over 1.2 billion bushels of wheat and nearly 4 billion bushels of corn. More than 80% of U.S. farms had mechanized tractors, and production was so vast that warehouses overflowed. What lay in this barn was not unusual. It was a fraction of a fraction, and that was what silenced the prisoners. One could almost hear their thoughts shift. Where they had once seen rustic wood, they now saw a symbol of an enemy's strength, simple, quiet, and impossible to overcome. The barn doors had opened not just to food, but to revelation. The silence lingered, unbroken, until a single crow cawed from the fields outside. Its cry echoed through the vast chamber, mocking the pride that had collapsed in the face of overwhelming reality. The silence inside the barn deepened into something heavier, a silence filled not with awe alone, but with shame. The German prisoners shifted uneasily, their boots crunching straw as they took in the sight before them. To their eyes, the scene bordered on the absurd. Food lay everywhere, in such abundance that it seemed careless, even wasteful. Corn kernels spilled across the planks. A crate of apples split open on the floor. Potatoes rolled unnoticed into corners. No one bothered to gather them. For men raised on years of ration cards, this was unthinkable. In the winter of 1943, children in Berlin had fought over potato peels in alleyways, while in Hamburg, families boiled nettles to survive the hunger after the air raids. One prisoner remembered his little sister scraping mold off a crust of bread to make it last another day. Now, he watched an American guard casually kick aside a scattered cob of corn. As if it were nothing, Unteroffizier Meyer, the same who had boasted about his family farm in Lower Saxony, felt his throat tighten. He remembered his sister's letter, "We boil turnips again," and the baby cries through the night. Yet, here, turnips sat in bins by the hundreds, unguarded, taken for granted. His pride twisted into something sour. He muttered to himself, "Children starve in Saxony, and here they drop food into the dirt." The abundance carried numbers that defied their comprehension. Each American farm in the Midwest averaged hundreds of acres. In Iowa alone, 1944, harvests yielded nearly 500 million bushels of corn. Milk production surpassed 120 billion pounds nationwide that year. Even the discarded overflow in this barn, a few bushels here, a crate there could have kept a German village alive for weeks. The prisoners' eyes told them this truth, even if their mouths refused to speak it. And yet, amidst the shock, the human instinct of hunger stirred. One prisoner bent quietly, almost guiltily, to pick up a fallen potato. His hand trembled as he turned it over, dirt clinging to the skin. He did not eat it, not yet. But the sight of a guard walking past without the slightest concern, no shout, no strike, no punishment, unnerved him even more. This food was so plentiful, it was not even guarded from waste. The barn had become a theater of humiliation. Their jokes about crude American barns collapsed under the weight of this reality here, with surplus so vast it bordered on insult. They could not reconcile the image of hungry families back home with the carelessness of plenty before them. And in that contrast lay the cruelest blow. What for Americans was routine abundance was, for these men, a living reminder of everything their homeland had failed to provide. Pride was crumbling, replaced by the bitter taste of envy and the unbearable sting of defeat. The guards stood relaxed, rifles slung casually across their shoulders, as if this mountain of food were nothing remarkable. One of them, a young sergeant from Kansas, noticed the prisoner's wide eyes and allowed himself a half smile. He gestured at the rows of sacks, the hanging hams, the bins overflowing with beans. "This is just one barn," he said lightly, almost with boredom. "There are millions more like it across the country." The words landed like a thunderclap. The German officers exchanged glances, searching one another's faces for some anchor of denial, but none could be found. A single barn had already felt overwhelming. Yet the idea that this was merely ordinary, a fraction of the nation's stores pressed down on them like an invisible weight. Hauptmann Adler bit his lip hard enough to draw blood. His diary, later confiscated by American intelligence, recorded his stunned admission. "We laughed at their barns. Now I see one could feed a division for weeks, if this is only one among millions. Then Germany was finished before we ever began." The guards spoke of farms with casual indifference, as though describing rain or dust storms. They mentioned entire railways devoted only to moving wheat, convoys of trucks carrying milk and meat from Midwest towns to coastal ports. One guard joked that in Wisconsin, even school children drank a quart of milk a day, to the POWs. Such talk was not boasting, it was the effortless truth of a nation that had never known hunger on their scale. Some of the prisoners tried to respond with a sneer, but the effort collapsed under the weight of reality. They remembered that back home. Families hoarded coal dust to press into makeshift briquettes. Mothers queued for hours to receive half a loaf. Soldiers at the front boiled horse bones to flavor watery stews. And now, here in the American heartland, the very structure they had mocked as primitive turned out to be a symbol of unimaginable strength. One prisoner whispered to another, "We believed America was soft." The reply came like a hammer soft. "They are so strong they can feed us, their enemies, and never notice the cost." For the Americans, barns were ordinary. For the Germans, barns had become terrifying. The scale of production was not just about food, it was about the machinery of a society that could outproduce empires, that could send millions of men to war while still stacking grain high enough to overflow. In that moment, the barn ceased to be a building. It became a mirror, reflecting the vast gulf between two worlds. One starved under bombs, the other overflowed with plenty. And the Germans, who once laughed, now stood mute, confronted not just by food, but by the shattering of an illusion. Tell me, if you were standing there as a prisoner, watching food spill casually onto the ground while your family starved thousands of miles away, what would you feel? Envy, rage, despair? Comment below. I want to hear your thoughts. That night in the barracks, the barn still haunted their conversations. The wooden walls echoed with whispers, half in anger, half in disbelief. Men who had once mocked the Americans now spoke in hushed tones, as if afraid the abundance might vanish if mentioned too loudly. Rumors spread like wildfire. Some claimed that trucks arrived every morning, unloading more grain and fruit than entire German districts could produce in a season. Others swore they saw milk delivered in great metal cans, gallons upon gallons. While in Berlin, children fainted in classrooms from hunger. One man muttered that he had heard America's railroads ran almost entirely for food during harvest time, entire trains filled with wheat thundering eastward, car after car, until the sound itself seemed endless. The gossip carried weight because every man in that barrack knew the truth of home. They remembered the hollow eyes of villagers begging for scraps, the smell of thin cabbage soup in frozen kitchens, the way their mothers stretched rations by mixing sawdust or ground acorns into flour. Here, in captivity, they were being fed more regularly than their families back home. That fact gnawed at them worse than the wire around the camp. Unteroffizier Meyer, once so proud of his farm in Lower Saxony, now kept silent. He stared at the ceiling, his mind replaying the American Guard's casual words, "millions more barns," in his diary. Later smuggled back to Germany, he wrote, "It is unbearable. We once believed ourselves the land of order and precision. Now I see we are beggars before a nation that treats plenty as ordinary." The psychological shift spread slowly but surely. An officer who had led the jeering earlier in the day refused to join the evening's card game. Instead, he sat with his head bowed, fingers tracing the rim of his tin cup. Another man, once defiant, muttered that America's power was not just its army, not just its planes, but the fact that even its barns held more food than the Reich's entire depots. And yet, in the quiet hours before sleep, humanity crept in. A prisoner confessed that he could not stop thinking of the smell of smoked ham drifting from the rafters. Another admitted that he had dreamt of a single loaf of white bread, soft and warm, the kind he had not tasted since 1939. They were men. After all, hungry, weary, and human, pride clashed with appetite, and appetite was winning. The barn had become more than a place of food. It was now a ghost, following them back to their bunks, sitting with them in their dreams, whispering that the world was not as they had been told. If you had been one of those prisoners, hearing rumors that even American school children drank more milk than your soldiers, how would that have changed your view of the war? Share your thoughts. Your perspective matters here. By the end of their first weeks in captivity, the laughter about American barns had disappeared completely. The men no longer scoffed when they marched past the timber walls, no longer sneered at the smell of hay. The barns had been transformed in their minds into monuments not of rustic weakness, but of a power they could neither fight nor deny. Hauptmann Adler, once loud in mockery, grew quiet. One evening, he admitted to a fellow officer, "We mobilized an empire and still could not feed our soldiers. They have barns overflowing and still find room to feed us." His voice carried no bitterness, only the weight of realization. That statement would later appear in a U.S. intelligence report, cataloged among hundreds of POW testimonies that confirmed the same thing. America's strength lay not only in its weapons, but in its staggering capacity to produce. For many prisoners, the collapse of pride was more painful than any chain. Their letters, censored yet preserved, tell the story in fragments. One man wrote to his wife, "They store more in one barn than we see in a year. I cannot explain it. I can only tell you that the war is already lost." Another confessed in a diary that he no longer dreamt of victory, but of bread, of butter melting on warm slices, of apples stacked in pyramids. Historians later calculated the scale that underpinned these impressions. By 1944, American agriculture employed nearly 7 million tractors, compared to Germany's fewer than 200,000. Grain yields per acre doubled those of Europe, and U.S. rail networks could carry over 600 million tons of freight annually. These numbers were invisible to the prisoners, but they felt the truth in their stomachs and in their silences. Years later, Long after the camps closed and the men returned home, the barns continued to haunt them. In interviews recorded in the 1960s and 70s, aging former POWs recalled that what struck them most was not the battlefield, not even the surrender, but the barns. One old man in Munich told his grandson, "I laughed at those barns once, but when I saw what was inside, I understood. No nation with such plenty could ever be defeated." The memory clung like the scent of hay caught in their uniforms. For some, it was a reminder of humiliation. For others, it became a strange form of respect, even gratitude, that their captors had shown abundance not as cruelty, but as simple reality. The barns had been mocked as cattle sheds, yet they ended as symbols of both defeat and survival. And so, the image endures sunlight breaking through the cracks in wooden boards, falling across mountains of grain and smoked meat, casting long shadows over rows of silent men. A barn, ordinary to one nation, unforgettable to another. When the war ended and the prisoners returned to their homelands, many carried with them memories too complex to speak of easily. They had survived captivity, endured humiliation, and witnessed a world that did not match the propaganda they had been fed for years. Yet among all the images that clung to them, the wire fences, the marching columns, the endless rail journeys, none proved as enduring as the barns. For in those barns, they had seen a truth that no speech, no statistic, and no battlefield could conceal. They had seen food so abundant that it spilled unguarded onto the floor. They had seen the casual strength of a society that could fight a global war and still overflow with plenty. And they had seen, perhaps most painfully, the difference between pride and reality. Decades later, in quiet villages and crowded cities, some of those men still spoke of that moment. An old soldier, now bent with age, confessed to a neighbor that at night he still dreamt of the smell of smoked ham hanging from rafters. Another admitted that his greatest shock was not the sound of bombers, nor the surrender itself, but the sight of children in America drinking fresh milk every morning without worry. For them, the barns became symbols not only of defeat, but of survival reminders that even in captivity, they had been fed by an enemy whose strength was measured not just in weapons, but in abundance. History often remembers battles, generals, and treaties, but history also lingers in smaller, quieter images: a shaft of light through a wooden wall, the rustle of grain in burlap sacks, the silence of proud men brought face to face with truth. Those barns, ordinary to Americans, became for the prisoners a haunting vision of why the war was lost.